The wind moved through the pines like a whisper. Snow clung to the ridges, thick and unyielding. And the only sound for miles was the crunch of boots pressing into frost. Elijah Boone had lived in solitude for nearly 6 winters. His cabin, tucked behind Hollow Creek and shielded by towering evergreens, was known by few and visited by fewer. That's how he liked it. The world beyond the mountains had taken more than it gave, and Elijah had made peace with that hard truth. At least, he had until the morning he found them. It was barely past dawn when Elijah heard the first cry. Not an animal, not the wind. It was unmistakably human, frantic, small, a child. He grabbed his coat, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and followed the sound, heart thudding with the sudden jolt of the unexpected. He found them near the ridge trail, huddled beneath a fallen tree. A woman, barely standing. Her coat was thin and torn. Her eyes, wild with fear and exhaustion, locked onto his as he approached. Beside her, 3 children clung to one another like leaves in a storm. 2 boys, one no older than 5, and a girl tucked between them with a cut across her cheek. "Please," the woman gasped. "We've been walking for days." Elijah said nothing for a moment, scanning the snow-covered woods behind them. No wagon, no tracks leading to safety, just survival. He didn't ask their story, not yet. He simply lifted the youngest boy into his arms, motioned for the others to follow, and led them back toward the cabin. The woman stumbled once, nearly fell. Elijah turned just in time to catch her. "You're freezing," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "I'm Mary," she whispered, barely conscious. "Mary Langdon. We've nowhere else to go." Inside the cabin, the fire roared to life with Elijah's practiced hands. He hung coats to dry, pulled out thick blankets, and heated broth while the 3 children sat trembling on the floor, too tired to cry. Mary sat beside them, her body swaying with exhaustion. Only after they'd eaten did she finally speak again. "My husband died in the storm, 3 nights ago. The wagon tipped in the river." She didn't cry. Her voice was too empty for tears. "We kept walking. I didn't know where we were headed. Just away." Elijah nodded once. "You're safe now. You'll stay here till the snow clears." Mary looked up at him then, her expression full of disbelief. "We've taken too much already." "You haven't taken anything," he said gruffly. "Not yet." That night, as the snow piled high against the cabin walls, Elijah sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. Across the room, Mary lay curled on a bedroll, the children huddled beside her, finally asleep. He wasn't sure why he'd brought them here, but something in him, something long buried, knew this wasn't just about kindness. This was something else. A turning, a beginning. The snow didn't let up the next day. It came harder, driven sideways by wind that clawed at the window panes. The cabin creaked, the fire hissed, and Elijah Boone woke before the sun like always. Except this morning there were 4 extra souls under his roof. He stood silently for a long moment, arms crossed, watching them sleep. Mary curled protectively around the children, all of them wrapped in wool blankets he hadn't touched in years. The smallest boy, Jamie, had his thumb in his mouth. The older one, Henry, slept with his arm over his sister's shoulder. And Mary, she looked like she hadn't slept in years, even now that she finally had. When they stirred, Elijah had already set a pot of oats to boil and stepped outside to check the snares. He returned with a rabbit and fresh kindling, snow dusting his beard and shoulders. Mary sat at the table, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. "I should be doing something," she said softly. "You are," Elijah replied. "You're breathing. That's plenty." She looked up at him. "You live out here alone?" He nodded. "No wife?" "No." She didn't press, and he didn't explain. It was a mutual understanding. 2 people shaped by loss, not looking to trade stories unless they had to. Over the next few days, the storm didn't ease, but routine began to settle in. Elijah hunted, chopped wood, fixed the roof where the snow had begun to bend it inward. Mary cooked, cleaned, tended to the children. The little girl, Lila, started humming when she swept the floor. Henry shadowed Elijah in the mornings. Jamie, still skittish, rarely left his mother's side. And every night, the cabin grew a little quieter. Not in sound, but in tension. The kind of quiet that meant safety. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had burned low, Mary sat beside the hearth with a small bundle of cloth in her lap. "My husband wasn't a bad man," she said without prompting. "Just too proud. He wouldn't stop pushing west even when we didn't have enough for the winter." Elijah didn't reply, but he stopped sharpening the blade in his hand. He thought if we could just get over one more hill, we'd find something better. Her voice broke there, and then one hill became the last. The silence stretched between them, but not uncomfortably. Finally, Elijah spoke. "My father was the same. Chased things till it killed him. Mary looked up. And you? I stopped chasing. She studied his face, worn and steady. No, she said. You just changed what you were chasing. He didn't answer. But her words stayed with him long after she'd gone to sleep. Outside, the storm howled louder than ever. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, and something else beginning to stir, quiet as new snow, a shape forming where silence used to be, a place where broken people could belong again. By the end of the week, the snow let up. Not entirely, it still drifted in flurries across the ridge, but the wind no longer screamed, and the sky was more gray than white. The worst had passed. Elijah stood outside with Henry, teaching the boy how to check a trap line. The lad was quiet, observant, not one to talk unless asked. That reminded Elijah of himself at that age, or maybe just the version of himself that hardship had carved. Why do you live way out here? Henry finally asked. Elijah didn't look at him when he answered. Because the mountain doesn't lie. Henry frowned. People do? People always do. Mountain never promised more than it could give. Henry nodded. Like that made sense in a way only a child shaped by hardship could understand. Back at the cabin, Mary was brushing snow from the porch steps, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. Elijah noticed the way she moved now. Steadier, stronger. There was purpose in her every motion, even if her eyes still held a 1,000-yard stare when she thought no one was watching. He stepped onto the porch and handed her a fresh-cut bundle of pine. For the stove, he said. Thank you, she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. You've done more than I ever expected. I didn't expect you to stay this long. She hesitated, then looked at the children playing in the snow, Lila tossing snow at Jamie, both laughing, their cheeks red from cold. I didn't expect to want to. That night, Elijah found a small note tucked beside the firewood pile. It was written in pencil on torn parchment. You may not think it, but you saved us, Em. He stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it inside a small drawer in his nightstand, right beside a silver locket that hadn't been touched in 6 years. A few mornings later, Mary asked, Do you think the road's clear yet? Elijah nodded. Could be, but you won't make it far with the little one walking. She looked down at Jamie, who clung to her skirts like a shadow. I know. There was a pause. I could take the sled to town, Elijah offered. Get what you need. Put word out. Mary met his gaze, searching it. You'd do that for us? I would. You barely know us. I know enough. When Elijah returned 3 days later, he brought supplies, cloth for new clothes, dried fruit for the children, and one unexpected item, a ribbon, soft blue tucked in the corner of the pack. He didn't say who it was for. But the next day, Lila came out of the cabin with it tied neatly in her hair, beaming. Mary didn't speak of it aloud, but that night she made stew thicker than usual, baked bread for the first time, and stayed up after the children slept. Elijah sat by the fire reading an old book. Mary sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. After a long silence, she said, I think they've started to believe this place might be home. He looked over at her. Do you? She didn't answer with words, but the way she leaned slightly into his shoulder said everything he needed to hear. Spring crept into the mountains like a soft breath. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of brown earth and stubborn wildflowers poking through the frost. Birds returned to the trees. The creek behind the cabin ran faster, swollen with melted ice. And in the cabin itself, something else was thawing, something deeper. Elijah didn't talk much about feelings. He wasn't built that way. But he showed them. In how he taught Henry to sharpen a blade without dulling the edge. In how he repaired Jamie's boots without being asked. In how he always filled Mary's mug first, even before his own. Mary noticed. And though she hadn't spoken the words aloud, she knew her heart was shifting. Not just from fear to safety, from survival to peace, but from silence to belonging. One morning, she stood by the creek with Lila, gathering smooth stones for the garden bed. The little girl ran ahead, giggling in the breeze while Mary knelt and touched the cool earth. Elijah approached quietly behind her, carrying a sack of tools. You planting something? She glanced up, smiling. Hope. He raised an eyebrow. She laughed softly. And maybe carrots. Later that afternoon, they worked side by side, digging into the ground, planting seeds, pressing them down with care. Henry carried buckets from the creek. Lila made up names for each row of vegetables. Jamie sat on the porch watching butterflies like they were magic. And for the first time in years, Mary didn't feel like she was preparing for the next disaster. She was planning a future. That night, after supper, they all sat around the fire, children sleepy, the scent of baked apples still hanging in the air. Henry was nodding off mid-sentence. Lila curled in Mary's lap. Jamie had climbed onto Elijah's legs without hesitation. already half asleep. Mary looked over and met Elijah's eyes. And in that moment, without a word, something changed between them. A knowing, a quiet admission. This wasn't just a temporary shelter anymore. This was home. Later, after tucking the children in, Mary stepped outside. Elijah stood on the porch, lantern light casting a soft glow across his features. She joined him, folding her arms. "They've stopped asking when we'll leave," she said. He nodded slowly. "Because they've stopped needing to." Mary hesitated then. "Do you want us here, Elijah?" He turned to her. "I didn't know how much I needed something until it was already here," he said quietly. "You didn't just bring noise and warmth into this place. You brought life." Mary blinked fast, her throat tight. "I didn't think I had any left to give." "You did," he said. "And you still do." She didn't kiss him. He didn't ask her to. But she reached out, touched his hand, and he held hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in the cool breath of mountain spring, a family was forming, not from blood, not from vows, but from choice. The days grew longer. With the coming of true spring, the forest stirred awake. Rabbits darted across the trail near the cabin. The hens began laying again. Sap flowed sweet and golden from the maples, and laughter, childish, full of life, echoed through the trees like it had always belonged there. Elijah had never imagined children living under his roof. He hadn't imagined a woman standing in his kitchen humming softly while kneading dough either. But now it all felt right, like the cabin had always been waiting for them. Henry followed Elijah around more than ever, asking about everything from weather patterns to bear tracks. Lila took it upon herself to decorate the front porch with pine cones and wildflowers. Jamie still stuck close to Mary, but he'd begun to smile more, laugh louder. And Mary? Mary had begun to glow, not in the way of polished charm, but with a quiet strength, like a fire that had never gone out, only dimmed until the right kindling arrived. One evening, Mary surprised Elijah with a new shirt she'd sewn from leftover cloth. "It's not perfect," she said, offering it shyly. Elijah held it up, thumb brushing the seams. "Neither am I." She smiled at that. "Maybe that's why it'll fit you just right." He tried it on. It did fit. Better than anything he'd worn in years. That night they sat outside after the children had gone to bed, the stars bright above them and the forest alive with spring song. Mary leaned her head against Elijah's shoulder. "I keep wondering when someone's going to take this away," she said quietly. "No one's taken anything," he said. "Not while I'm here." She turned to face him, searching his eyes. "Elijah." "Yes?" "I think I stopped surviving. I think I started living again." He didn't speak right away. He just took her hand in his, warm and rough and steady. "Then let's keep living, together." And for the first time since she'd stood on her husband's grave, Mary allowed herself to imagine what tomorrow might feel like, without fear, without running, just planning, laughing, waking up beside someone who stayed. The next morning, the children found them sitting side by side on the porch bench, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her back. Henry smirked. Lila whispered, "I knew it." Jamie just climbed onto Elijah's lap like it had always been meant for him. Elijah ruffled the boy's hair, smiling as the sun rose through the trees. And though no words were spoken, the message was clear. This wasn't temporary. This was family. Summer arrived with golden light and quiet promise. The hills burst into green, and the garden Mary planted in spring now bloomed with proud stalks of corn, tomatoes heavy on the vine, and a neat row of carrots that Lila insisted she'd planted with magic. The cabin, once a place of silence, now pulsed with rhythm, chopping wood, children's laughter, the clatter of pans, and low murmurs between two people learning how to share a life. Elijah had never been busier, and he'd never been more at peace. One Sunday morning, Henry asked if he could build something of his own. "What kind of something?" Elijah asked. "A pen for goats, if we ever get some." Elijah raised an eyebrow, amused. "You planning to stay that long?" Henry shrugged. "I don't know, feels like we already have." Elijah handed him a hammer and a short length of rope. "Then let's build it right." That same afternoon, Mary stood by the window, watching the two of them work. "You've changed him," she said, not even realizing she was speaking aloud. Lila, who was braiding cloth into a doll, looked up. "Mama, maybe he changed us." Mary smiled softly, brushing a curl behind Lila's ear. "Maybe we all changed together." That evening, Elijah took Mary on a walk beyond the ridge, just the two of them. The children stayed behind with stew and a storybook. The sky above them glowed in shades of fire and rose. They stopped near an old tree stump, and Elijah reached into his coat pocket. Mary's breath caught. "Elijah." He pulled out a small carving, rough but thoughtful. A wooden ring, shaped from pine, smoothed with beeswax. "I've never had much," he said, "and I don't know what the right way to ask is. But if you stay here, if you keep staying, I'd like you to be more than the mother of the children sleeping under my roof." Mary's eyes welled. "I want you to be the woman I grow old beside." She didn't answer right away. She just stepped forward and slid the wooden ring onto her own finger. "Then you already got your yes." There was no preacher, no lace, no bells. But in the days that followed, Mary Langdon became Mary Boone, not because of law or tradition, but because of love and choice. She stitched a new quilt with all their initials in the corner. Henry carved his name into the porch post. Lila made a flower crown and declared herself maid of the house. And Jamie began calling Elijah Pa, without anyone telling him to. The cabin beyond Hollow Creek, once cold and quiet, now thrummed with life. And as summer rolled on, the family that wasn't born but built prepared for the seasons ahead, with full hearts and a promise stronger than any storm. By midsummer, the cabin felt like it had always been theirs. The walls no longer echoed. They breathed. With the scuffle of small boots, the creak of the rocking chair, the rise and fall of gentle voices sharing dreams by lantern light. The family that had once arrived, cold, hungry, and grieving, now lived in rhythm with the land and with each other. Elijah watched it all unfold quietly, never seeking credit. He fixed what was broken, sharpened what dulled, and stood as the still point in a life that had once known only motion. And Mary, his Mary, had become the heart of that stillness, not just for him but for everyone under that roof. One morning, Mary woke early to prepare biscuits, humming softly as she kneaded dough. Elijah entered quietly behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder. "I've been thinking," he murmured. "That sounds dangerous," she teased, smiling. "I want to build a second room, bigger, with windows facing the creek." She turned to face him, flower on her hands, surprise in her eyes. "A nursery?" He hesitated, then nodded. Mary blinked. "Elijah, you've given me more than I knew I needed," he said. "I'd be a fool not to want to grow this." She laughed, warm, bright, and emotional. "Then I guess we're building more than walls this time." That afternoon, Elijah began marking beams and clearing the space beside the cabin. Henry helped dig post holes. Lila braided ribbons to hang on the finished window. Jamie practiced carrying boards, determined to be part of the process. The entire family worked together. No orders, no complaints. Just shared sweat and shared vision. One night, as the stars blinked into place above the ridge, Mary and Elijah sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. "Do you ever think about how it started?" she asked softly. He nodded. A blizzard, a broken trail, and a cry in the woods. "If we'd arrived an hour later, I would have found you anyway." Mary looked over. "You really believe that?" "I don't believe in much," he said, brushing a thumb over her knuckles. "But I believe in what we built. And I believe you were meant to be here." She rested her head on his shoulder, heart full. "And now," she whispered, "we build a life around that belief." As August gave way to cooler winds, the nursery frame stood tall beside the cabin, unfinished but strong, just like them. They weren't rushing, they weren't escaping. They were planting roots, and for the first time in years, each step forward wasn't taken in fear, but in faith. September came wrapped in gold. The leaves turned early that year, amber and copper spilling from the trees, collecting in drifts along the trail and crunching underfoot. The air grew crisp, and the scent of wood smoke lingered longer in the mornings. At Hartstead Cabin, harvest had begun. Mary filled jars with preserves, peaches, blackberries, pickled beans. Lila sorted them with great importance, sticking tiny paper labels to each one in shaky handwriting. Henry helped Elijah stack firewood in neat rows, taller than the boy himself. And Jamie, curious and barefoot, followed the chickens around the yard, asking every living thing if it needed help. There was no doubt. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was home. The nursery's walls were finished by the second week of the month. Light spilled through the new windows every morning, warming the floor where Jamie now took naps, and Lila sometimes lay beside him, whispering stories about stardust and brave queens and snowy kingdoms. Mary stood in the doorway one afternoon, hand resting on the frame, watching them. Elijah came up behind her. "We'll need a rocker," he said. Mary turned, eyes shining. "And maybe another bed." He looked at her still and steady. "You sure?" She nodded. "I haven't been this sure of anything since the day I knocked on your door." That night, Mary sat by the fire with a needle in hand, stitching a new quilt. The pattern was simple. Squares from old shirts, Elijah's flannel, scraps from Lila's first dress, even a corner from Jamie's worn-out blanket, a memory in every thread. She wasn't just making warmth. She was preserving legacy. The next morning, a letter arrived by courier. The children squealed at the rare excitement. Mary opened it carefully and read it twice before speaking. "It's from my sister," she said. "She's alive. She made it to Colorado with her husband and wants to visit." Elijah didn't blink. "She's welcome," Mary smiled gently. "You didn't ask questions?" "Didn't have to. If she's family to you, she's family here." Jamie looked up. "Will she bring pie?" Everyone laughed, and Mary wiped a tear from her cheek as she said, "She just might." By the end of the week, the nursery smelled of cedar and candle wax. A rocking chair sat by the window, and Mary placed the finished quilt across the end of the new bed. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, built by hands that once trembled, warmed by love that once feared it might never return. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the world turned bronze, Elijah stood beside the gate he had once repaired alone. Now, he watched a woman pin laundry, children chase chickens, and a future he'd never imagined unfold like dawn breaking across his land. He didn't speak. He simply breathed and stayed. The first frost came quietly in October, just a shimmer at first. On the roof, on the edges of the grass, on the empty clothesline stretched across the yard. But it was enough to remind them that winter would return, as it always did. Mary stood on the porch that morning, arms folded over her belly, watching the way the sun melted the frost like a second chance. Elijah came out beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one, but his eyes were on her. "You feeling all right today?" he asked. Mary gave a tired but contented smile. "Tired in the best way. This little one's kicking like he's clearing a trail through my ribs." Elijah chuckled low in his throat. "Stubborn already." "Like his father." He raised an eyebrow. "Like his mother." Inside the cabin, the children were finishing breakfast. Lila was helping Jamie learn to read from a tattered primer. Henry had grown taller, his voice deepening slightly, his shoulders squaring with pride. He had become a young man with calluses on his hands and steady eyes, just like Elijah. He watched over his siblings like it was instinct. No one told him to. That afternoon, Elijah took Jamie and Henry into the woods to check the snares. It was one of the last mild days before the cold set in for good. The light filtered through yellow leaves, and the earth smelled like pine and old rain. On the way home, Jamie tugged at Elijah's coat. "Pa?" Elijah looked down. He hadn't forced the title. The boy had started using it weeks ago, softly at first, then with more certainty. "Yeah, bud? Do babies cry all the time?" Henry smirked. "Sometimes," Elijah said, "but not forever." Jamie nodded solemnly. "Good, because I like sleep." Back at the cabin, Mary had started knitting tiny socks by the fire. Lila brought her needles and pretended to help, more interested in colors than stitching. When Elijah and the boys returned, the scent of fresh bread met them like a warm embrace. Dinner was simple, stew and warm slices with butter, but laughter filled the room, and Elijah realized something he hadn't thought of in years. He wasn't afraid of winter anymore. Not with them here. Not with this life. That night, as the fire burned low and the children lay bundled in their beds, Elijah and Mary sat quietly in the nursery. The room was finished now. Ready. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. "Not really." "You are," he said without hesitation. "Here, always." She reached for his hand and laid it over her belly. The baby kicked once, then again. He looked at her, startled. Mary laughed softly. "That's his way of saying he heard you." Elijah smiled, slow, deep, the kind of smile that came from a place healed. "I hope he knows he's already got everything he needs." Mary met his gaze. "He will because we do." Outside, the frost returned, but inside the warmth held. And in the small cabin beyond Hollow Creek, something sacred had taken root. A life not just of survival, but of belonging. The morning the snow returned for good, it came without wind, just a quiet fall, soft as breath, layering the trees and rooftops in pale silence. Elijah stood outside early, splitting wood as he always did. But this time, when he turned to head back toward the cabin, the window glowed with more than firelight. Mary was standing there, smiling sleepily, a cup of tea in hand, her figure silhouetted by warmth and home. He paused for a moment, just to look. How far they had come. How far she had come. Inside, the cabin had been transformed for the season. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. Quilts were stacked neatly near the hearth. Lila had crafted paper snowflakes with string and tape and insisted on hanging them across every window. Jamie and Henry had built a small sled from scrap wood and took turns pulling each other down the hill behind the barn. Mary moved slower now, heavy with child but never stopped. She knitted, she cooked, she sang, she laughed more. Sometimes she cried without warning, and Elijah simply held her, saying nothing, because he understood. He too had once broken without a sound. They spent that week preparing for the birth. The midwife from the valley rode up on a mule, bringing linens, oils, and the calm strength of a woman who had seen life enter the world many times before. "You're doing just fine," she told Mary. "You're stronger than you think." "I don't feel strong," Mary admitted, voice trembling. The midwife smiled. "The strong ones never do." Elijah built a cradle. He didn't talk about it much, just worked in the evenings by lantern light, shaping smooth wood with calloused hands. The others saw it slowly take shape. Even the children grew quieter around it. One night Lila asked him softly, "What will the baby be like?" Elijah paused, rubbing the edge of the cradle smooth. "He'll be ours," he said. "That's enough." The night labor began. The sky was clear. The fire was steady. And Elijah had just finished placing the last log in the stove when Mary gripped his hand and whispered, "It's time." Everything after that happened in a hush. The midwife arrived. The children were sent to the other room, Henry holding Jamie and Lila close, and Elijah stayed. Through every cry, every breath, every whisper of pain, he held her hand and whispered words he'd never said aloud before. "You're not alone, not now, not ever." And then, the silence was broken by a cry. "Small, fierce, alive." The midwife laughed through tears. "A boy." Elijah blinked fast. His chest felt too full. Mary, exhausted but glowing, pulled the baby close and looked up at him. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He's ours," Elijah said again, this time with a voice that cracked like thunder and melted like snow. Later, when the baby was wrapped and sleeping against Mary's chest, the children were let in. They crept in with reverence. Jamie climbed up beside Mary and peered at his new brother. "What's his name?" he asked. Mary looked at Elijah, and Elijah looked at them all. "Let's name him Hope," he said softly, "because that's what brought you to me." Mary nodded, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Hope Boone," she whispered, "born of snow, held by love." And outside the window, as snow fell over the mountains, the cabin stood lit from within. Not by fire alone, but by family. Hope Boone was small, but his presence filled the cabin. From the moment he arrived, everything shifted, subtly, beautifully. Mary moved like a seasoned mother again, even with her tired eyes and slow steps. Elijah, once quiet and reserved, now hummed lullabies under his breath as he carved toys by the hearth. The other children took to baby Hope with a mixture of wonder and responsibility. Lila appointed herself assistant mama, always hovering near with a rag doll or spare blanket. Jamie brought pine cones and shiny rocks for the baby to look at. Henry never said much, just stood close, hands in his pockets with a protective look in his eyes. One evening, Mary caught Elijah staring at Hope while he slept. "Something on your mind?" she asked. Elijah didn't look up. "Just remembering who I used to be." She walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You still are. You're just more now." He nodded, voice low. "I never thought I'd be someone's father." "You already were," she whispered, "long before Hope was born." As winter deepened, the family hunkered down together. Evenings became sacred. Candles flickered. Stories were told. Henry began journaling. Lila wrote songs. Jamie learned to whittle. And Mary, whenever Hope allowed it, finally started sketching again, the corners of her papers full of flowers, snowy peaks, and tiny faces framed in curls. Elijah hung her drawings near the door without a word, but everyone noticed. Then came a letter. Unexpected, thick paper, wax-sealed. Elijah opened it by the fire. It was from an old acquaintance in the valley, a landowner seeking help managing a larger property through spring and summer. "They're offering a partnership," Elijah said slowly, "a share in the land. It's real." Mary raised an eyebrow. "And you'd still live here?" He nodded. "Always." Henry looked up. "Could we help?" "You'd be part of it," Elijah said. "All of you." The idea stirred something in them. Possibility, expansion, legacy. That night, Mary and Elijah sat under a sky glittering with stars. "A new season's coming," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But we don't leave the old one behind." She leaned into him. "No, we carry it with us." And as the wind stirred the pines and Hope cooed in his cradle nearby, Elijah whispered, "I've carried so much loss. I think it's time I carried something else." "Then carry this," Mary said gently, placing his hand over her heart. "Carry us." The cabin stood in silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of echoes, of love, of warmth, of second chances. And in the hills beyond Hollow Creek, a man who once walked alone now had footsteps beside his own, and a future walking right behind him. Spring crept in quietly that year. It came not with thunder or rain, but with the slow unfurling of wildflowers across the meadows, with the soft rush of meltwater returning to the creek, and with a warmth that settled into bones once chilled by loss. At the Boone homestead, everything stirred to life. Hope began to laugh, a rich, bubbling sound that filled the cabin like sunlight. His tiny fists grabbed at Elijah's beard and Mary's hair with equal force, as if anchoring himself to the two people he had unknowingly saved. And outside, the land whispered of growth. Elijah took on the partnership down in the valley. 3 days a week, he rode out before dawn and returned by nightfall, saddle-worn and satisfied. The property was vast, the work was hard, and yet it felt different this time. Because he wasn't building a stranger's dream anymore. He was building a legacy. Each beam lifted, each fence post set, was done with Mary in mind. With Henry, Lila, Jamie, and Hope. He pictured their feet running across those fields, their futures rooted in more than survival, in purpose. Back at the cabin, Mary thrived. She and the children began tending a garden double the size of the one last year. Lila planted a row of sunflowers just because they looked like joy. Jamie learned to fish with Henry's help and returned with muddy boots and exaggerated tails. Henry, now tall and steady, built a second chicken coop with timber Elijah had left stacked beside the barn. And Mary, she smiled more. The shadows under her eyes had faded. Her laughter came easier, and in quiet moments, she would stand at the edge of the creek, baby on her hip, and whisper to the wind, "Thank you." One Sunday, Elijah returned home early. He found Mary outside hanging linens on the line. She turned at the sound of his boots, hair loose in the wind, baby Hope resting against her chest. "You're home," she said. "I couldn't stay away," he replied. "Not today." She tilted her head. "What's today?" He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, 2 silver bands. "No church," he said. "No guests. Just this moment. You, me, the kids, and a promise made under our own sky." Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Elijah and Mary stood in the field, surrounded by the children. Henry held Hope. Jamie and Lila carried wildflowers. The breeze was soft, the air smelled of pine and sweet grass, and the sky was painted in rose and gold. No preacher needed, only hearts wide open. Vows spoken in plain words but heavy with truth. "I choose you every day," in storm and harvest, in silence and song. And when they kissed, the children cheered, the chickens scattered, and even the wind seemed to bow around them. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, husband and wife not by law but by love, by choice, by every mile that had brought them there. That night the cabin glowed with firelight and laughter. A family built not by blood but by grace, by grit, and by the quiet, powerful decision to stay when running seemed easier. Summer settled over Hollow Creek like honey, slow and golden. By June the valley was in full bloom and life at the Boone homestead buzzed with rhythm. The day started early, ended late, and passed with a satisfying weariness that only honest work can bring. Elijah rode into the valley most mornings, dust clinging to his boots and sunlight warming his shoulders. But now, he never left without Mary pressing a kiss to his cheek, or Jamie running behind the horse yelling, "Bring back stories!" And when he returned, Mary's silhouette would be waiting at the door. Always waiting, always smiling. At home, Mary had become the quiet center of their world. She taught Lila how to spin wool. She helped Henry build shelves in the barn. She read aloud to Jamie beneath the shade of the cottonwood tree, her voice soft and steady, as baby Hope napped in her lap. They had created something rare, not perfect, but true. One afternoon, while cleaning out the root cellar, Elijah found a tin box behind an old crate. Inside, a letter. Faded, addressed to the next owner of this land. He brought it to Mary, who opened it gently by lamplight. The letter spoke of the man who had first built the cabin, how he'd come west with a dream and a broken heart, how he'd found healing in the quiet and the soil, and how he hoped that whoever followed would protect what the land gave freely. Mary folded the letter with care. "It's like he knew we'd come," she whispered. Elijah touched her hand. "Then maybe healing runs deeper here than we thought." In late July, a summer storm rolled through, the kind that rumbled for hours and soaked the land through to its roots. That night, the family gathered close, reading by firelight as rain drummed steady against the roof. Mary rested against Elijah, her fingers laced in his, the children curled nearby with sleepy eyes and full hearts. Hope babbled in his cradle, waving a fist at thunder like it was a game, and Elijah looked around at the scene before him. Every face he loved glowing with warmth, safety, and something more. Belonging. After the storm passed, something shifted. Henry asked Elijah to teach him how to trap and tan hides properly. Jamie insisted on learning to ride without a lead. Lila, to everyone's surprise, began sketching like her mama, capturing sunrises, wildflowers, and the lines of her papa's hands in charcoal and paper. Even baby Hope, now crawling with reckless joy, had begun to find his voice. "Elijah," Mary said one night, "I think this place is making us whole." He nodded, voice low. "No, we're making it whole." Later that week, Mary returned to her creekside spot. She carried a journal, sat down, and wrote her first full letter in years, addressed to no one in particular. "I thought I was lost," she wrote, "but the forest didn't just shelter me. It found me, held me, gave me back a name." In the stillness of those summer nights, with crickets humming and lanterns flickering in the cabin windows, Elijah often lay awake beside Mary, hand on her waist, wondering how silence could hold so much joy. A man who had built a wall around his grief now lived in a home that let the light in. August brought bounty. The garden burst with green and gold. Tomatoes ripened in clusters. Corn grew tall. Beans twisted up their poles like tiny green dancers reaching for the sun. Lila and Mary spent early mornings barefoot in the dirt, harvesting together, giggling and humming tunes passed down from nowhere and everywhere. Henry had become Elijah's shadow, helping manage the valley land, mending fences, even learning to read contracts by firelight. He had grown leaner, stronger, more sure of himself. And Jamie, ever curious, was now obsessed with birds, spending long hours near the woods with a journal and feather tucked behind his ear. Hope, not to be outdone, had learned to stand and fall and laugh at both. One morning, Elijah returned from the valley with news. "A man came by," he said. "Surveyor from town. They're planning to run a new supply road closer through these parts." Mary's brow furrowed. "Closer? How close?" "Close enough to change things." They sat on the porch that night, lantern light swaying with the wind. The idea of change hung heavy. "Will it ruin what we've built?" Mary asked. Elijah looked out toward the trees. "No, not if we remember why we built it." The news stirred something in Mary, a sense of urgency. She began writing again, letters to her sister back east, to the women she once knew in town, even one to a widow she'd met only once. Not all were sent. Some were just for her. But the message was always the same. There is still hope. And Elijah, he started carving a new sign to hang at the edge of the path. "Boone Homestead, Esta by Grace." One Saturday, the whole family took a wagon into town. It was the first time they'd all gone together since Hope's birth. People stared, some curious, some kind, some unsure what to make of a man like Elijah, and a woman like Mary raising a family of 5 in the woods. But Mary held her head high, and when they walked into the mercantile, the shopkeeper, an older woman with more heart than patience, looked at Mary's children, then at Elijah's steady hand around Mary's waist and said simply, "Well now, that's a story I'd pay to read." Mary laughed out loud for the first time in days. On the ride home, Lila asked from the back of the wagon, "Are we ever going to move to town, Mama?" Mary turned, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "Would you want to?" Lila shook her head. "No. I want to grow old where the sky's bigger than the buildings." Elijah smiled at that. So did Mary. That night, they sat together as a family in the twilight, eating cornbread and honey by candlelight. And Elijah stood, raised his tin cup and said, "To the ones we've lost, to the ones we've found, and to the life we built where no one thought it could grow." Mary lifted hers next. "To wild hope and steady hands." Even Jamie joined in. "To us!" And in the flicker of that moment, with laughter rising into the rafters and a baby giggling under the table, the cabin glowed like a lantern in the dark, guiding hearts home. September came in quietly like a respectful visitor. The leaves on the maples began to turn, slow and golden. A new chill crept into the morning air, crisp enough to see breath, but not yet enough to bite. Hope took his first steps across the wooden floor of the cabin. 3 wobbly strides from Mary to Elijah, arms out, laughter spilling from him like a stream breaking through thawed ice. Everyone clapped. Henry even picked him up and twirled him. "Looks like someone's ready to chase rabbits." Elijah grinned. "Or trouble," Mary added, shaking her head lovingly. The Valley Partnership had grown. Elijah had earned respect, not by shouting, not by outbidding, but by showing up. Quiet, dependable, kind. The type of man who made the people around him believe that goodness didn't need to make a scene. One of the ranchers in town offered to sell Elijah a parcel near the river. "We'd still live here," he told Mary, spreading the map across the table. "But if I take this, I could give the kids something long-lasting. Land they'll raise their children on, maybe." Mary studied the lines. Then she looked at him. "You already gave them something lasting, Elijah. A place to belong. A father." Meanwhile, Mary had plans of her own. She organized a gathering at the homestead, the first ever. Nothing fancy, just food, a bonfire, an open invitation to the women she'd written to in the past year. Those who'd lost, those starting over, those tired of pretending to be strong when they were breaking inside. And to Mary's surprise, they came. By sundown, 8 women and 2 older men from different parts of the county had gathered at Hollow Creek. Some brought cornbread, others jars of wildflower honey, or hand-stitched shawls to trade. They shared stories around the fire. Mary spoke gently, not preaching but telling her truth. "I thought I was done," she said, "but I wasn't. I was unfinished. And this place, it let me start again." The group nodded, some wiping tears, others gripping hands. Later that evening, as the fire crackled low and stars blinked overhead, one woman leaned toward Mary and whispered, "What you've built here, it's more than a home." Mary didn't respond right away. She watched Lila place a quilt over a sleeping Jamie, Henry help one of the visitors carry logs to the fire, and Elijah smiling as he held Hope close. Then she answered, "It's a beginning." As guests rode off the next morning, Mary found a small bundle left on the porch, a necklace carved from river stone and a note that read, "For the woman who reminded me I still had breath left." That night, Elijah brought out the sign he had been working on for months, Boone Homestead. "For those becoming whole again." He looked at Mary. "Shall we hang it?" Mary took a deep breath, nodded, and together they drove the stakes into the ground at the bend where the path met the woods. A new chapter, not just for them, but for anyone who might follow the same lonely road, and find it ending not in sorrow but in family. October brought a hush to the land. The wind no longer whispered, it sang. Through the trees, across the fields, into every crack of the old cabin. The Boone homestead stood strong, wrapped in a quilt of amber leaves and golden light. But something else was stirring, too. Change. Not the kind that knocks the door down. The kind that waits just outside, watching, waiting for an invitation. Elijah had become a man of many names. To Hope, he was Daw. To the Valley ranchers, he was Boone. To Henry, Jamie, and Lila, he was simply Pa. And to Mary, he was home. One afternoon, as Mary stirred cider by the hearth, Elijah returned from town with a letter in hand. A legal envelope. His face unreadable. Mary turned from the pot. "Everything all right?" He handed her the letter. "It's an offer," he said. "For the Valley land. A good one. Fair. But they want to buy it all." "All?" "Even our parcel." Mary went quiet. Elijah leaned on the table. "I said no, without even reading the rest." Her eyes met his, questioning. "Because no matter how good the offer is," he said, "this land, this isn't just property." He pointed toward the walls, the windows, the distant hills. "It's our story." Mary walked over, took his hand. "And stories like this aren't for sale." Later that night, Elijah sat by the fire with Henry, passing him a knife with a curved wooden handle. "Time you had your own," he said. "You've earned it." Henry studied the blade, his voice quieter than usual. "You think I'll be ready to take over someday?" Elijah nodded. "You're already doing it. One honest choice at a time." Meanwhile, Lila had started writing songs again. Soft ballads about the wind, the stars, and a cabin that saved her mama's soul. She sang them to Hope, who clapped in delight even if he didn't understand a word. And Jamie? He'd learned to ride bareback, fish with a net, and cook eggs without burning them. Well, mostly. Mary often caught him talking to himself like a narrator. "Jamie Boone, defender of Hollow Creek." The boy had dreams, and now room for them. As Halloween neared, the Boone family hosted their second gathering. This one smaller, cozier for neighbors and new friends. They roasted pumpkins, shared stories, played fiddle tunes while children danced barefoot in leaves. Hope wore a little bear costume that Lila had sewn. Even Elijah laughed like a boy again, chasing Jamie around the fire. That night, Mary whispered as they lay in bed, "I wish I could bottle this moment." "You can," Elijah murmured. "It's already inside you." She turned toward him. "What happens next?" He wrapped an arm around her. "We keep building, day by day, one breath at a time." Outside, the sign they'd staked into the earth swayed gently in the wind. Boone Homestead, for those becoming whole again. And the cabin, like the family it sheltered, stood strong, not in defiance of storms, but because it had weathered them together. November arrived with a quiet grace. Frost kissed the windows each morning. The animals grew thicker coats. The days shortened, but each one glowed with the warmth of routine and love. Inside the Boone homestead, the fireplace crackled from dawn until dusk, casting light and shadow across the walls like a memory being written in real time. Mary had begun preparing for the winter months early. Jars lined the pantry, quilts stacked high and boots oiled and set by the door. But it wasn't fear driving her. It was wisdom. This wasn't survival anymore. This was care. One morning, a letter came addressed to Mrs. Mary Boone. It was from her sister. After 2 years of silence, the envelope trembled in Mary's hands. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she walked down to the creek alone, the letter clutched in her palm, breathing deep the scent of pine and cold earth. Then she sat on the same rock where she had once held hope for the first time and opened the seal. The letter was short, but it said everything. I was wrong. You didn't run. You rose. I want to see the life you've built, if you'll let me. Mary sat for a long time staring out at the rippling water. Then she smiled. A week later, a stranger rode up the Boone Trail. Slim, proper, with a city coat and eyes that reminded Mary of her mother. The children watched from the porch, cautious. Elijah stood with arms folded, protective but calm. The woman dismounted and looked up at Mary, tears already glistening in her eyes. You're really here, she whispered. Mary stepped forward. I never left. They embraced beneath the birch tree, the past folding into the present like it had simply been waiting for the right season. The next few days were filled with stories. Mary's sister, Clara, learned the children's names, tasted their cornbread, and watched Lila draw by lamplight. She cried when she saw the quilt Mary had made from their grandmother's scraps. And that night, when Elijah placed another log on the fire and poured cider into her cup, Clara finally spoke what had weighed on her chest for years. You built more than a home, Mary. You built redemption. Clara's visit didn't last forever, but it left its mark. Before leaving, she left behind a leather-bound journal and a promise to return by spring. I want to help others the way you helped yourself, she said. Mary hugged her tightly. You always could, you just forgot. As snow began to dust the rooftops, Elijah and Henry finished reinforcing the barn walls. Jamie and Lila made snow angels while Hope toddled through the yard, bundled like a potato. Inside, Mary stood by the window watching them, one hand resting gently over her heart. You see them? Elijah asked, coming up behind her. I feel them, she whispered. Every laugh, every footstep. It's like the house remembers the ache that used to live here and celebrates that it's gone. That evening, around the fire, Mary opened the leather-bound journal and wrote, The cabin gave me roots, but my family, they gave me wings. The first true snow came early in December. It blanketed Hollow Creek in white silence. Not the heavy, oppressive kind. This was soft, almost reverent, like the land was tucking itself in under a quilt. Inside the Boone cabin, laughter echoed from wall to wall. Lila was teaching Jamie to fold paper stars for the windows. Henry chopped wood without needing to be asked. And Hope had discovered the joy of licking icicles from the porch railing, even if Mary fussed every time. Life had rhythm now. A music made of firewood cracking, soup simmering, boots stomping in from the cold, and voices raised in warmth, not fear. Mary stood by the fire one evening, holding the old, faded letter Elijah had found that autumn, the one from the original owner. She turned it over, staring at the back where someone had written in pencil, Whoever finds this, let the land make you better than you were. It stayed with her. That week, a knock came at the cabin door. It was Cole Hastings, a younger man from a neighboring ranch. His wife had passed 2 winters ago, and he was raising 2 children alone. He stood in the snow, hat in hand, eyes weary. Elijah, he said, I heard you've built something solid. I don't mean just fences. I mean family. He glanced toward the warm windows, the shadows of laughter flickering inside. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. Can I come by again sometime, learn? Elijah opened the door wider. You're already welcome. Mary stepped beside him and added, We all start out not knowing. What matters is you showed up. From that moment, the Boones became more than a family. They became a root. Other folks came by. A widow with 2 older boys, a woman fleeing a cruel uncle, a quiet young couple hoping to live simply, away from town. Mary helped them plant winter crops. Elijah taught them to split logs and read weather signs. Lila began drawing portraits of the families. Jamie offered guided tours of the woods, and Henry taught a boy his age how to mend boots. They weren't building a town. They were building something quieter, something truer. Christmas Eve arrived with candles and cider. The cabin was full to the rafters. Friends, newcomers, children bundled in quilts and scarves. They sang, shared bread, and read from the old Bible that had once belonged to Mary's grandmother. Then in the stillness of the night, Mary stood and spoke. This land gave me a second chance, she said. But you, each of you, reminded me why that chance matters. She turned to Elijah. I thought I'd come here to disappear, he smiled. And instead you became seen. That night, as snow drifted quietly outside and Hope slept curled in Mary's arms, Elijah whispered words he hadn't said in years. Not because he didn't feel them, but because now they meant everything. I love you, Mary Boone. You didn't just save me. You rebuilt me. She kissed his hand. No, Elijah, we rebuilt each other. Outside, a lantern swayed on the porch. Inside, a new chapter turned quietly, not with drama, but with peace. January brought the deep cold, the kind that crept into the bones, even under layers of wool and flannel. The creek froze solid. Smoke curled from chimneys all day long. But inside the Boone homestead, the chill never quite made it past the threshold. Warmth lived there, in the walls, in the hearts, in the steady daily acts of love. Elijah spent most mornings tending to the animals and checking in on the families now scattered across the nearby hills. They had started calling their small community Hollow Ridge. It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. But to those who lived there, it meant belonging. Mary, meanwhile, found herself at the heart of something unexpected. The women from the winter gathering had begun writing her regularly, not just to say thank you, but to ask questions about parenting, grief, rebuilding. She wasn't sure when it started, but one day she looked at her stack of letters and realized she'd become someone people trusted. You should write a book, Clara had said in her last letter. Call it The Boone Way. I'd buy 10 copies. Mary laughed at the thought, but the seed had been planted. One evening, as snow fell softly outside and the others were asleep, she sat by the window with pen and paper. Not for a story, not for anyone else, but to remember. We weren't healed by a miracle. We were healed by choosing love. Every single day, Lila had become something of a storyteller herself. She'd started keeping a notebook of her own, sketches of neighbors, wildflowers, and little poems about home. One afternoon, Mary read over her shoulder and found this. Home isn't where you're safe. It's where you feel strong enough to face what's not. Mary wiped a tear before Lila could see. Henry asked Elijah about taking on more land in spring. I want to start something that's mine, but still part of this. Elijah nodded. That's what a legacy is, son. Not what you take, what you grow. Henry stood straighter after that. Then came the storm, late January. 4 feet of snow in a day. Wind strong enough to knock over sheds. The roads vanished. Even the creek disappeared under layers of white. For 3 days, the Boone cabin became the center of refuge. Neighbors gathered in their big room. 6 families sleeping on floors, wrapped in blankets, cooking meals over the same fire. But no one complained, because when the world went silent and cold, this place remained a beacon, a fire that didn't go out. On the 3rd night, Mary stood at the window, Hope curled against her shoulder. Do you think we're crazy? She asked Elijah. Taking all this on? He looked at the crowded room, the laughter, the shared bread, the peace. No, he said. I think this is what the world was supposed to be before it forgot. When the storm passed and the sun returned, Hollow Ridge dug itself out slowly, but with joy. Because they knew now what few ever did, that sometimes the wildest places hold the strongest roots. Spring came like a promise whispered through thawed earth. The snow melted slowly, revealing shoots of green beneath months of ice. Hollow Ridge stirred to life. New fences, new calves, new hopes. The valley shimmered with potential. At the Boone homestead, Mary stepped barefoot into the sun for the first time in weeks. Hope ran clumsily through mud puddles. Lila hung fresh-dyed quilts across the porch rail. Jamie built a birdhouse with Elijah, who swore a family of robins had been eyeing the maple near the window. Then something beautiful happened. The town schoolteacher, Mrs. Dunley, paid a visit. She'd heard about the children in Hollow Ridge, many of them without access to formal learning, and offered Mary a wild idea. What if we started a schoolhouse here? She asked. On the ridge, small but real. Mary's heart fluttered. Not because of the idea itself, but because it was something she'd never dared to imagine when she arrived with nothing but fear in her children's hands. A future. By June, Elijah and Henry had cleared a patch of land just beyond the cabin. Together with neighbors, they began building a one-room schoolhouse. No one asked to be paid. They just showed up, because that's what you did in a place like this. You showed up. At the opening ceremony, Mary stood before a gathering of families, holding Hope in one arm and a basket of wildflowers in the other. We came here broken, she said. But this land didn't fix us. We fixed each other. One shared meal, one mended fence, one act of courage at a time. She turned to the children sitting cross-legged on the grass. This place isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning. And now, you get to write your own stories. Starting here. They cheered. Lila played her fiddle. Jamie hugged every single person. Even Elijah smiled longer than he ever had before. That night, the family sat on the porch watching the stars. The fireflies danced like tiny lanterns across the field. Elijah, Mary said softly, I used to think I'd lost everything. And now? He asked. She took his hand. Now I realize that loss made room for everything that matters. He kissed her temple, and in his silence she heard it all. Somewhere down the valley, someone new was arriving. A woman alone, clutching a satchel. Behind her, 3 children. Ahead, a trail leading up toward the hills, and toward something she couldn't yet name. But she would find it here, as others had, because the Boone homestead didn't just belong to Elijah and Mary anymore. It belonged to everyone still brave enough to believe in second chances.